Even when the dust settles, I think the clear direction is that we are not going back.
And we are living and breathing an environment, particularly when I talk to clients, that this idea of national security is economic security.
The goal isn't to predict every outcome. That's very difficult to do in this environment, but it's to avoid being surprised by the next policy move.
Welcome to our latest edition of the EY-Parthenon Geostrategy in Action series. This is a continuation of our discussion on the evolving geostrategic environment, how our clients are being impacted, and most critically, how they should plan and act. Our topic today is one that has animated client responses from strategy to supply chain to tax and risk management. It's that of global trade and policy. And we'll orient the discussion around the changes emanating from North America, though representing changes that are happening actively globally. My name is Adam Barbina. I'm the EY US Geostrategy Leader, and I'm pleased to be joined by my colleague, Blake Harden, who is the Senior Chief Trade Policy Officer of Washington Council EY in Washington, D.C. Blake, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, for having me.
Fantastic. Blake, the size of the North American market and the continued dispersion of supply chains and value chains is evolving, and clearly a highly active U.S. trade policy environment impacts companies across the globe. We've talked that it is critical for business leaders to, one, assess their operating models, right, and plan and anticipate for risks around scenario planning, et cetera. And I wanted to start with something that has been animating really quite recently around the USMCA, or the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which represents roughly 30% of global GDP, and I think a fifth of kind of imports globally. And given that we now have entered kind of the formal review period, though there still appears to be a lot of uncertainty, can you give us an update on what you're seeing, what you're hearing from clients in there, and what you really expect to go forward from the USMCA, given its impact across kind of American, Asian, and European businesses globally?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, Adam. This is really an important moment for the USMCA. So, as you mentioned, we just had the first formal joint review, which is the mechanism set up by the agreement for the three parties to come together and assess, how is this going? Are we implementing the commitments we agreed to? Are there updates that we need to make to that agreement? And if they were satisfied with how things were going, they could elect to renew the agreement for another 16-year period. So July 1st was the date that the three parties, the US, Mexico, and Canada, met. We understand they met virtually. And ultimately, the United States chose not to renew the agreement in its current form. But that doesn't mean the USMCA expired, right? So the agreement, as it's currently drafted or in effect, is still in place until 2036. And so now we've moved to this kind of rolling review process where the parties are going to continue to talk. They're going to continue to discuss improvements or concerns that they have. And then at any point along the way, before we get to 2036, they can still elect to renew the agreement for a new 16-year term. I think perhaps what's interesting here is that a lot of the discussion so far certainly has, touched on more traditional trade agreement type issues, but also some really kind of new issues that we've typically not seen discussed within a trade agreement framework, notably around things like economic security. And really, the discussions are happening along two different tracks right now. The U.S. and Mexico have formal negotiations. They've just completed their third round. They've announced a fourth round that's going to take place in Washington, D.C. in September. They're talking about a range of issues. And the US and Canada, very different track. They are not sitting at the formal negotiating table yet. Yes, they are having discussions, but again, not formal discussions. And so there's some other issues in that bilateral relationship that still need to be addressed. Timing wise, we understand the administration is hoping to have perhaps some outcomes in each of these bilateral tracks before the end of the year for the president. But that trilateral discussions, some thornier issues like rules of origin, those will continue into 2027. So I think, we have the rules in place, there's stability there, but the longer this drags out, obviously, the more uncertain it becomes for businesses because we don't know what the future rules are going to be just yet.
Thanks. I mean, you highlight one, kind of the uncertainty, even though I think we understand some of the signals, right? And you really brought out this point around national security, right? And we are living and breathing an environment, particularly when I talk to clients, that this idea of national security is economic security. And it really points to, I think, the widening of the aperture of trade policy to achieve a number of goals, like you've said, and businesses are actors in that, but also need to respond to that. And so appreciate you sharing that. Let's widen the aperture a bit. We are now about a year and a half from the April 2025 global tariffs that were put on from the US administration. And I want to expand kind of where you think trade policy is likely to go and what trends you think are most important to business leaders. And maybe also expand on, are you seeing diversification happening, as we know that's part of kind of the impact that we're seeing in terms of tariffs? What are kind of the clear signals maybe that you would point to as people start to set their strategy or rethink their strategy and operating models?
Well, yeah, I mean, great observation. So, absolutely, over the last 18 months, we've seen a really robust use of tariff authorities for both trade objectives, but also, as you point out, more of these economic security related goals that the administration has. And they've been pretty consistent about what the goals are. The tariff authorities that have been used over the last 18 months have changed, but the purpose is really remaining the same, and that is, frankly, reindustrialization here in the United States. Really try to bring back onshore, nearshore, manufacturing capacity. I think that is also part of the strategy to create more balanced trade relationships with trading partners, and really coordinate. Um, on economic security issues. So things like export control alignment or, tariff alignment when the administration is interested in a particular concern and trying to bring allies along with the United States. So it's a tool that's being used in all sorts of different ways. It's trades being used to address things like digital services taxes or to create movement and alignment on critical minerals policy. The U.S. Trade Representative has the lead on creating a plurilateral trade agreement that the United States is working on in the critical minerals space. I mean, this is really new and unique. And so you're right. I mean, this is a more muscular trade policy. This is certainly focused on U.S. manufacturing capacity, increasing domestic manufacturing capacity. This is very different from a pure trade liberalization model. And it, certainly should factor in investment and sourcing and pricing decisions. I think the other piece of this too is that the administration recognizes that this will increase the cost of doing business in some cases, particularly on the critical sectors or the strategic sectors that they're focused on, and they accept that as part of this. And so we're moving beyond just straight efficiency into a very different model moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think you paint a picture of if it's a lot of different things that fit into this, and so I think trade policy sometimes gets put into a corner, but it really is forcing kind of the reevaluation of kind of strategy and supply chains, and I think the way that companies handle the idea of kind of risk management or overall kind of what their geostrategy is, from that. You've said a lot there, but I just want to kind of just double click in terms of if we were to kind of forecast, right, kind of thinking about the future environment. Some of the signals are quite clear, and I think just to ask you a question, right? What do we need to think about beyond kind of the headline rates, right? Which gets a lot of attention, but there's some really kind of, I think, sticking points, as you mentioned, reindustrialization. But there's a lot in that. So maybe can you unpack a little bit about what you see some of those really important kind of elements will be if you were to think about kind of clarifying the policy going forward?
Yeah, I guess I would frame it this way that, that even when the dust settles, if when we feel like we're perhaps not in such an uncertain environment where things are changing so rapidly with tariff rates and the trade policy, I think the clear direction is that we are not going back, let's say rewind, even 10 years, 20 years to what a pure trade liberalization policy here in the United States looked like. And I think that's probably true for other countries as well. That there is, real interest in addressing what I think some see as over reliance on, just one country for particular goods, particularly in critical sectors. And so there will be a structural rethink, and this idea that it may cost more to make certain things will just be kind of part of the new system. Again, wherever it's setting forward. So I think for companies certainly need to be understanding where your kind of top vulnerabilities are, where you're, placing your supply chains, who you're doing business with, understanding that, you may need to have agility to move quickly. You may not always be able to predict what the next policy is going to be, but really understanding your business and coordinating your teams across multiple different parts of the business, operations, legal, public affairs, government affairs, your tax folks, like tying all of those up and making sure there's good muscle memory to be in constant contact, to be reassessing risk on a more frequent basis, I think is going to be required to both react, but also take advantage from a competitive standpoint, for your business moving forward.
Yeah, really good points, right? I mean, I think you highlight, right? This is wrapped up in there's rates, but there's obviously market access, there's rules of origin focus, there's going to be continued kind of regulatory scrutiny of, how are you contributing, I think, to the objectives, right? And all of those really require a bit of a rethink. And I like how you put it, kind of agility or being able to kind of pivot and understand what those scenarios are. Um, Maybe as we think about this and kind of just take it a step forward, are there any salient kind of client stories that you would reflect on in terms of how they've thought about the market or trends or adaptations that you think are best in class or that you're noticing?
Yeah, well, everyone is in a different part of the journey. We still have a very active tariff policy and trade policy, going forward this year. But I think that the questions have really shifted to, from what is the rate to what is this actually going to cost us, and even more so, how do we manage it? A lot of it centers on how the different tariff measures interact. So there's a lot of additional complexity now in trying to understand tariff exposure, which tariffs stack on top of each other, which perhaps don't. What are the exceptions? Are there opportunities for and credits, in certain sectors? If you're investing more in the United States or building more in the United States, there are different programs. And so it's a really complex landscape, but managing the complexity is something that a lot of companies are certainly focused on. I think one interesting point on the complexity is a good illustration of this is the recent tariffs that were announced on Canada using a little known, nearly 100-year-old statute called Section 338. This is of the Tariff Act of 1930 that allows the president to impose tariffs of up to 50%. It's never been used. Um, this is unique in that USMCA qualifying goods are not exempt from these tariffs once they take effect August 19th. And I point this out because for the most part, USMCA qualifying goods have been exempt from much of the tariffs that we have seen. And this is a first instance where that is not the case. So I think it also reinforces the point that runs across the whole environment that qualifying for one preferential program like USMCA won't necessarily shield a product from action under a different law. So, exposure can really come from all different directions. One trend I highlight, and I think, more companies should really consider is engaging earlier in the policy process. Some are paying closer attention to comment periods, agency proceedings, the USMCA review. Others are still waiting until the rules are final. And I think the risk is that, there may be fewer options to shape or prepare for the outcome if you aren't engaged in the process. And so I think that engagement has been, I think, very helpful for some companies to really prepare their business, but also potentially help steer the conversation happening, in the highest levels of government.
Yeah, I mean, take that point, and you're obviously seeing that in DC around the engagement piece. I would say we also see this importantly internally to engage, right? That we've seen the importance of not operating necessarily in silos, right? But this is a cross-functional, cross domain issue, right, internally in companies and how they manage it and who's monitoring and who's advocating on behalf of the company. So that's a really good point. Let's just wrap up here, maybe on kind of the upside. And when you think about it, you obviously talked about kind of what companies should be doing on the engagement side, but are there kind of opportunities that you're seeing companies find in this uncertainty, and maybe what recommendations would you have to help them find kind of those upsides?
Yeah, there certainly are opportunities, depending on where the company sits. I think alongside tariffs, I mentioned we're seeing targeted incentives and policy signals that support investment in U.S. production capacity. We've seen that connected with a number of the different tariff regimes that have been announced that some companies are really wanting to take advantage of, and that can put them in a much better competitive position. It's not going to fit every business, but I do think it's worth assessing whether the current policy environment aligns with your company's strategy. And then maybe frame this as more than reacting to individual policy changes. I think companies that read the environment early, adapt thoughtfully, certainly will be better positioned as the landscape settles. I think my recommendations are threefold, and we've talked a little bit about each of these. I think is one, scenario plan, right? Don't anchor in one forecast. Model a range of tariff and even USMCA outcomes, and try to test how those would affect your footprint. You just mentioned this. I know I've mentioned this. Connect the right teams within your business. Trade policy touches strategy, operations, finance, legal, commercial priorities. I think companies that are bringing those perspectives together can make decisions faster and with more confidence. And again, like that helps them maintain a competitive edge because all companies are experiencing the same environment. um, and prioritize policy engagement. Again, I'm in Washington, D.C., but, so I can't help but say, focus on two or three developments that matter most to the business and decide, where input can be constructive. I think, the goal isn't to predict every outcome. That's very difficult to do in this environment, but it's to avoid being surprised by the next policy move. And to try to make trade policy part of your strategic planning, not just a compliance response.
Yeah, those are all really good things. I mean, like what I take away from this conversation, right, is that we fundamentally believe trade is here to stay. But certainly, the assumptions that we've relied on, perhaps of how it will take place and what some of the kind of the fundamental, maybe market access or regulatory environment is likely to change and will continue to be uncertain. So I appreciate that. I'll also point out we have written about kind of the future of globalization being asymmetric, and I think this really points out to this idea of different access for different pieces across different industries, and that is going to be really important to plan. So in closing, I want to say thank you for sharing your thoughts today, and for all of our viewers for joining this. It is clear, right, that we're in a dynamic environment that is likely to change, and we are here to share those insights with you, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode of Geostrategy in Action. Thanks very much.